many of you have uttered the phrase, "I only draw stick people," or "I'm just not that creative"? As human beings, we're quick to categorize ourselves in any way possible. Female, Midwesterner, middle class, art teacher, coffee drinker. This is necessary sometimes in order to function, like when we encounter an unfamiliar situation and we need to figure out how to respond. But the danger, however, comes when these categories and labels begin to create limitations in how we see ourselves and what we're capable of. 7 years ago, this became obvious to me in a class that I was teaching. It was art methods for future elementary teachers. Now, it seemed like every time I invited them to do something creative, there was a good group of them that would attach a disclaimer to their work. "I don't draw. I'm not that creative. My work isn't good enough." Now, I'm not picking on future elementary teachers here, as I think we're all familiar with that phrase, either having said it or heard it. So, at that point, what I decided to do was to work with it. Now, fear shows up even when we think we've prepared. And for these students, this is what it sounded like: a lack of time, a lack of talent, and performing and being judged. So what we decided to do at that point was lay it out on the table. As the instructor, I was tired of hearing the story. So we would write it down on cards at the beginning of the semester, we would name it, and we would talk about it. Now, each one of these things would lead us to 3 important steps. Because this is what I figured out at that point, is that if we were going to invite fear in, it had to be 3 different things. I started to think about teaching the way Stengel did when she wrote, "To teach is to disrupt another's taken for granted worldview." And so the positivity and the potential that I began to see in fear were these 3 steps. The first step was acknowledgement. We named it, and we started to try to figure out where it was coming from. The second step was doing that with an ounce of humility and understanding that the fears that we had was not a missing piece of who we were supposed to be, but that they were part of an evolving self. And the third step was that deliberate move towards action alongside fear. So my students and I opened the door to the unknown, to fears, to misconceptions, and we started to think about what it meant to trust a process and a self that included fear. Now remember those 3 fears I talked about: lack of time, lack of talent, and performing and being judged. Well, we walked towards these things. We worked in the classroom to move things out of the way, change the context of our environment, switch it up a little bit, and get students on their toes, literally, on their feet, moving around and confronting each other. We also would create things that they would then perform for one another, facing those fears of performing. We would get on stage at a local community theater, and we would practice getting out of our comfort zones. We would address misconceptions that we had about teaching and about learning, and practice advocacy for who these students wanted to be, and what did that sound like, and what did it look like. Now, we did this visually, of course, too. This was an art methods course. So we talked about our perceptions, and we drew, and we created, and we visualized, represented our perceptions of art and creativity, of learning, and what it meant to be an effective teacher. We also did this in conversation with one another, approaching each other's work through feedback. And then collectively we did this, understanding that the whole of our experience is greater than the individual parts, and that it's only that we struggled with similar concepts, that these fears, they repeated, and they were similar stories, so we could talk about those. And that these fears that we had could lead us into conversations that would allow us to move forward together. Now, those dreaded group projects that are in every class that every teacher makes you do, I did too. And each one of these became a more collaborative opportunity for students to then see themselves and everyone else a little bit more clearly. They could identify with the fears and those struggles because we'd had so many conversations at that point. And they could begin to navigate together and start to build together, metaphorically and physically. And the fears and the questions that remained and that would continue to surface, remember that inevitability of fear, they would become a blueprint for a more confident self, where students could acquire new knowledge and experiences that would allow them to move forward with their fears and still be brave and confident at the same time. And then perhaps we start to see a more holistic picture, a self and a life that can include fear. I challenge you to consider fear as a positive step in the learning process. Consider it a part of who you are, how you feel, what you believe, and how marvelous it is to encounter new and different experiences every day. We can give ourselves the opportunity to appreciate and acknowledge the fears that we have, knowing that in doing so gives us a broader and deeper understanding of the world. Thank you.